Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I thought I would do a video on a sort of refresher of some strategies and approaches to reading that sometimes we forget. And the reason this came up, I recently had a discussion with Philip Chase and with Joanna, and we were talking about the Wars of Light and Shadow. And one of the commenters, Prater Zinn, had left a comment saying that they really weren't enjoying the book and they had a number of points for the reasons why. So before I get started in all of this, I want to say straight off, if you're not enjoying a book and you sort of go, this is why I'm not enjoying it, that's fine. No one can ever say you must enjoy this thing. That's not the point. But there is a difference between this is dumb because these things and I am not enjoying. And Prater Zinn gave reasons for why they are not enjoying this book. And again, I want to reiterate, they are perfectly entitled to feel that way. No one is saying that they shouldn't. But some of the issues that they raised, I think, tie into how we read, expectations we have for the text, expectations that we are not necessarily promises being made by the text, but externally we're pushing onto it. And also an element of presentism, where we are projecting a moral judgment onto people and expecting people in a completely different situation, in a completely different culture, in a completely different secondary world, should conform to our moral beliefs. So there are a bunch of elements here that I want to go into. But again, to be very, very clear, Prater Zinn is perfectly entitled and should absolutely have every right to say that they are not enjoying the text. That is fine. I'm not arguing with that. But it raises a couple of really interesting issues. So in this brief discussion, I'm going to be talking about Wars of Light and Shadow, and there may be very minor spoilers, but I'm going to be speaking in generalities. And the second thing is, this is more about some of the approaches that we take to reading. And I'll use aspects of the Wars of Light and Shadow to talk about this, but this applies to lots of different books. So let's start with the Wars of Light and Shadow having a frame narrative. There are a lot of different books and series that have frame narratives. And one of the things that we as readers often do is we read the frame narrative and go, right, yeah, fine, whatever, moving on. And then we follow the story. And basically, we forget that this is all part of a narrative that has been framed by a context. So, for instance, Nathaniel Hawthorne in The Scarlet Letter starts with a frame narrative. Here's a fine text, because this is meant to give it a level of authenticity. It's a level of verisimilitude. It's meant to be an historical story that he has discovered. And part of that is a way for Hawthorne to defend himself about against any particular accusations that maybe he was being critical of something that he shouldn't be critical of. He was casting people in a bad light, particularly as some of the people in it are historical people. But when you read The Scarlet Letter, you always remember that Hawthorne had set this up in the beginning as if this was real, as if everything happened, that this is a found historical text. And as we are reading, we're constantly keeping that in mind as we read. The same thing with the Wars of Light and Shadow. At the beginning of the very, very first book, we are told there is a history of the world that is commonly held, commonly understood, and believed to be the true events. But these people, from a different point in the future, when the story that's going to unfold is, they're in the future. They have looked back. They have used their magical abilities, and they're going to reveal what actually happened. So from the very beginning of the Wars of Light and Shadow, Wurts uses a frame narrative to say, this is what these people are saying are the true events, because what people believe are actually untrue. And so everything from that point on, everything that is revealed to us as a reader, we are meant to be thinking about it, at least if we're going to take into account how you use frame narratives. I know people get, a wee bit upset about this, but that sets up, we are getting an insight into what happened that no one else has. So it is signaling very early on, if you were alive at this time period, if you were alive in the time period of these people looking back in time, you would be shocked to see this version of events, because that is not what you believe. That is not how this history of the world has ever been told or ever explained. What we are seeing here is a version of events that contradicts everything that we know. And because of that, as we read, we're reading all of these things, and we have to remember that's not the default view of the world. This is meant to be the real thing that happened. Imagine if you'd never seen anything about World War II. You just heard about World War II, about the heroic soldiers storming the beaches. And then someone showed you that beach landing sequence from Saving Private Ryan. Again, it's a fictional account. It's not exactly what happened. But the brutality of that would be shocking, because that, in a lot of the stories about the storming of the beaches, and a lot of the reports about the storming of the beaches, the savagery, the brutality, the loss of life, everything about it that was visceral and violent was toned down, was soft pedaled. That's not what you tell your populace. You give them the view about the victory and the sacrifices that people made, but it's very abstract. There might be numbers attached. We lost, so many troops, but it's an abstract number. But as soon as you see it happening on the beach, as soon as you see that, you have a completely different visceral reaction to it. And you're meant to. It's meant to show the brutality. So when we witness these events and we see how barbaric some of them are, we are meant to judge them and go, yes, these are barbaric events. But if we think about history, if we think about the history in our world, how many times has a dominant power, you've heard the expression, history is written by the victor. How many times has the dominant power reported or reshaped history to make themselves look better and their actions justified, even when those actions were incredibly barbaric, when they were incredibly inhumane, when they were cruel and unjustified and horrendous? That we rationalize a lot of the darker aspects of our histories, because owning up to that guilt, owning up to the fact that, what was that, the Mitchell and Webb show, and they had the two officers in the trenches, and it's, hang on a sec, are we the bad guys? That can be very difficult to be aware of when you're in the midst of it. And so that frame narrative at the beginning is saying, listen, the people of this world, they don't know this. They think they are the good guys. They think that what they did was justified. They think that this is how history unfolded. But we've gone back in time. We've looked at it and gone, no, that's not how this history has unfolded. Facts have been hidden from us. Facts have been relayed in a certain way. If we think of the British Empire's colonization and occupation of India. How that narrative is relayed, how it was relayed at the time if you were in Britain, how it was relayed if you were in India, those were two completely different stories, but one became the dominant narrative. And it's only because, particularly in our time period, that historians are developing more accurate, more balanced, less biased accounts of things and bringing things to light. And we still see people struggling with, well, why are you bringing that up? And we saw it with various aspects of British culture, of American culture, with the question over statues of people who had done very questionable things, and they had these statues venerating them. Why did anyone make a statue of this person if they were so terrible? Because the narrative quite often spun about someone, the narrative that is projected into the public consciousness, privileges certain information and de-emphasizes other information. So we see that happening in our world. We know that that is the frame of this story. And so when we see these events unfold and go, how can anyone side with these people? You're like, just look at our history. That's how you know how people can side with these people. But that leads me into my next point. My next point is there is a difference between reader knowledge, particularly given the frame, and character knowledge. So Praetor's Inn had complained about the sort of the Alliance of Light, and these were terrible people who did terrible things. How can people support that? And there are a number of really straightforward explanations for this that not only are logical, rational, and support the position of, yeah, this is what would happen. And the first is, if these soldiers in battle did something terrible, they aren't going to report that to the general populace, are they? Unless someone investigates and finds out and publishes the results. How are the people hundreds of miles away meant to know what a small group of soldiers did? They are only going to know what they are told. There's the first point. This world does not have mass communication. It does not have instantaneous communication. It does not have 24-hour news channels. It does not have historians investigating all of these things. It doesn't even have independent investigators on either side making sure that their leaders and their military forces are telling the truth. Everything is highly subjective. And so the expectation that soldiers who had committed war crimes are going to return home and say, by the way, I know you're all celebrating our victory over the enemy, but I committed a bunch of war crimes. You know, that's not psychologically real. And one of the aspects of modern writing that we pretty much want in a lot of adult writing is psychological realism. We want the world to be verisimilitudinous. We want this element of authenticity. So why would these people, when they return home, declare that they are the villains? First of all, they believe that they're justified in what they did. We are told repeatedly in the text that the townspeople hate the clanspeople. The townspeople have these cities, these trade routes, and yet the clanspeople keep raiding them, keep stealing from them, keep destroying their trade caravans. And they're barbaric. They live out in the forest, not like real civilized people. And so we see that centuries of conflict where the townspeople have been dehumanizing until it becomes a stated base norm. That everyone in the town believes that these clanspeople are subhuman. They are not the same. They aren't civilized. They are barbaric. They are basically animals. And they are despicable, immoral people because they keep stealing and raiding and won't live like civilized people. That's the base norm for the townspeople. And so you can imagine how that, in the mind of these soldiers going out to defeat this enemy that they have had for centuries, they feel more justified because these people aren't properly human. That is a level of psychological realism that we have unfortunately seen deployed throughout history. Even to this day, the dehumanization of an enemy, that is all too common. Because once we have dehumanized the enemy, once we've reduced them to an animal state, then the moral imperative to treat them well disappears because they don't deserve it. It doesn't apply to them because they're not actual proper people. We see all sorts of horrendous, inhumane acts justified because we believe the other side aren't worthy of being treated as humans. That it is more important to protect the humans we know and love. We can understand that bias. The things we would do to protect our loved ones and our family, we wouldn't necessarily do to protect some random stranger on the street. This is part of our lives. And so when you apply that on a grand scale to these sorts of things, first of all, the soldiers feel justified in what they are doing. They want to punish the Klansmen. They want to destroy the Klansmen. And they feel justified in doing so. But we as reader are not one of the townspeople. We are reading this. We are seeing this from this perspective, this frame narrative of, you may know this history. You may have been told that you were on the side of light. But this is what the side of light did. So it calls into question this belief that they have. And it's giving us ground to stand on to go, no, these people did this thing. But this thing is bad. But the people living in the towns don't necessarily know about it. Then you think, well, what about the leaders? A bunch of them will know. And you go, yes. Think of the leaders of many of the civilized nations on this planet, what they knew about and what they let people get away with. Again, the lure and ambition and the lure of power, ambition, personal desire for power, keeping power at all costs, justifying, oh, well, I'll maybe make compromises on my ethics in this sense, or maybe not even having ethics in the beginning because you are so focused on accruing personal power. How people quite happily lie to others publicly in order to get more power. Or they could be true believers and are spreading something from their rigid worldview. Again, we see this represented in the text time and time again. True believers who have latched on to this thing and they see the world only through that lens. But we also see people who are not true believers, but see this as a means to accrue more power, more wealth, more influence. And they're willing, because it doesn't affect them personally, to destroy other people because it gets them more power. And they don't care who gets thrown under the bus as long as it's not them and theirs. And again, that is reflected in the text. It's not that people go, oh, look, these people all did really horrible things. I think they're good. That's not what is being presented in the Wars of Light and Shadow. Added to all of this, we have Lysair and this Alliance of Light building on centuries held prejudice and reframing it in terms of religious ideology. A belief that in order to do good, you must destroy evil. And those people are evil. Those people are supporting the personification of evil. Those people are doing evil things. And it's terrible. But we have to make the tough choice to eradicate evil. And because it's presented in this form of religious fanaticism, it's not about a rational, logical worldview. It's not about balancing the pros and cons. It's about leaning into that fanatical zealotry and showing the danger of fanatical zealotry. And of course, all of this is complicated because we as reader have a much broader, wider view of the world. We can see and witness all of these different things happening, but the people in the towns cannot. There are even instances where someone orders something to happen, but the person doesn't carry out that order, then says that they did. There's even an instance where someone realizes that these witnesses to this thing could damage morale, and so disposes of the witnesses, then fabricates a report saying that, oh, something else happened entirely. But how could they believe that they're the good guys? Because this sort of thing happens. We've been given concrete examples of it. These are not the only examples in the world. These are not the only instances of stuff like this happening. These are examples to show us this is what happens. And so we extrapolate from that point and say, right, if that soldier is doing it, if that officer is doing it, if these people are doing it, added to all of this is we have seen elements of this is a magical compulsion. And the person who is being compelled, Lysair, is a consummate politician. He understands the people around him. He understands what makes them tick. He understands the importance of public performance. He understands turning himself into a symbol, that the symbol is believed, not the reality of the man. And just very, very light spoilers here. At one point, Lysair makes a big hue and cry, this big performative, how dare you take slaves? Taking slaves is terrible. No one should be a slave in my kingdom. Fast forward a very short time later, and it is expedient for him now to have slaves. And so in private, he signs legislation to allow slaves. But the thing is, the public view of him was defending these creatures, these clansmen who had been captured, and saying, oh, I wouldn't even agree with slaves, even though what he was going to do to them was pretty terrible anyway. That's the public view of him. But then quietly, behind closed doors, where the public doesn't have insight, he's, yeah, but we need the slaves, we need the rowers, let's just get that done. And so for the members of the public, they're looking at this and go, oh, but he must have been convinced to do this by other people who were advising him, because I saw him, I heard about how good he was, how he protected these people. And incrementally, like the story about the frog in the slowly heating up water, the public is shaped and brought round to excusing all sorts of contradictory behavior, something that 5 years ago they would never have agreed with, but now incrementally has been chipped away, that they accept it as normal, as a reality, that, oh, well, it's just one tiny little step further. And each time it's that incremental erosion of the position. And all of this goes to how we read. We have to remember that characters do not have the information in the overview that we have. We see things that other characters don't see. We have knowledge of events that other characters cannot possibly know. So we're in a much better position in terms of knowledge. Wolfgang Iser referred to this as the knowledge gap. We as reader have far more knowledge than the basic characters and the commoners and all of those elements of the general populace of the world. We, in fact, have more knowledge about what different events are occurring than the major characters because we see it from all of these different points of view. Because of that, expecting characters to act on knowledge they can't possibly have is an unrealistic expectation. But then we think about Prater's Inn had another complaint that it's basically the same thing happens each time. And this occurs a lot when we are taking a structural view where we strip away what is happening, the surface level detail, the specifics of these events and how these events are in a specific context. If we do a sort of structural view, much like Campbell did, Campbell stripped away the individual aspects of story to find these structures and said, oh, look, this structure is common across a number of different stories. And that's where we get the hero's journey from. But we don't look at it and go, that story is the same as that story. We recognize that they have similar structures, but what they are saying, how they are saying it, what they are doing with it, that is all original. That is all individual. And so there are similar structures at play, but they are being investigated in very different ways. And as Wurts has continued the series and is finishing it off, actually, in it's the last volume is being published in 2024. The depth and complexity of the world is slowly unfolding, like the layers of an onion slowly being peeled away to get deeper and deeper into it, to realize that some of these surface level conflicts actually have roots in something else. It's about the exploration of the complexity of a lot of these conflicts. We can say, oh, X and Y are always at war. They've always been at war. How did it start? Oh, it was that thing. But as soon as you start digging into it, you realize there are layers of nuance and complexity and interactions. It's not simply a tit for tat. It's not simply a, well, they did the bad thing first. It's usually a lot more complex than that. And then over time, as attacks, counterattacks, defenses, over and over again, one side does something bad, the other side then does another thing bad. It builds up until both sides believe that they are in the right and the other side is in the wrong. We see this in the real world. And so with a lot of these events, it's not that it is, oh, well, it's just this thing being explored that way, that it's the same structure in the same events. You can take that structural approach, and I have done, lots of people have done, and you can go through and go, that film, that film, that film, and that film. They all use exactly the same structure. They all use the same types of events. They all follow the same plot progression. But we don't look at them and say, that is the same as that film. Logan and, what was it, Terminator 2. The film Logan and the film Terminator 2, remarkably similar in a number of respects, but radically different in a number of respects. They are individual films that utilize a lot of the same structure and events and sort of story type. Even some of the characters are remarkably similar, but they are actually quite different films in a number of regards. And so when we point at a story and say, well, it's just that same structure, we have to acknowledge that we have stripped away everything that made it unique, everything that made it individual, all of the nuance and complexity that was in the writing. We've stripped all of that away and we're just looking at plot movements. But as soon as we do that, we have to realize that you can do that with almost every fantasy series and almost every fantasy book. You can do that with all of them and distill it down into something that is bland and simplistic because, yeah, that's an aspect of what structuralism can do. One of the last points that Prater's Inn had raised was in all of these different books, someone who thinks Arathon is bad meets Arathon and realizes he's good. That, I think, is a slightly, and again, they're perfectly entitled to say it that way. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but it's a slightly reductive way of considering what we are being shown. One of the most heartrending aspects of the book that I recently read and discussed with Philip and Joanna, there's a character in that who was a firm member of the Alliance of Light, gets captured, realizes that the foundational precepts of the Alliance of Light aren't quite the firm foundations and bedrock that she believed. So when she is returned, absolutely unharmed, she says, I still believe in the Alliance of Light. I still believe in you. But I think there's a better way of doing this. I think we are misjudging these things. But as I had said earlier about this sort of perspective, this zealotry, this ideology that is overriding any sort of rational comprehension of what is going on, any deviation from the accepted position, the accepted orthodoxy, is going to be punished. We can think back to an event in quite recent American history in which something terrible happened. And the response of America was, you're either with us or against us. A simple binary. And this character says, right, I am with you, but what you want to do isn't entirely justified. We should rethink this, that there are better ways of doing this. And the response is, you're either with us and against us. Because you are not 100% with us, you must be against us. Therefore, you're a problem. Not everyone who meets Arathon meets that same fate. There are a lot of people who meet Arathon and he is judged. He is put on trial. He is tested. But we see that Arathon is doing his best under bad circumstances. But he still does some pretty bad things. He's not some blameless hero. He is at times cruel and arrogant and callous. We're given reasons why. We're given insight into why. But if we just looked at his actions, we can see how people could judge him harshly. But in the self-same book that I discussed with Philip and Joanna, we get to see a moment when Arathon transforms into the thing that he is being accused of. We see and are shown explicitly the danger he actually does represent. And we realize that while Lysair is cruel and has done all of these things and has this ideological hatred, he's not necessarily completely unjustified in that position, because we see what happens to Arathon when this curse is unleashed. And it complicates things, but it only complicates things if we think about it, if we let it, if we engage with what we are being shown. But if we just go, oh, he turned into that thing and then turned back and everything is fine, we miss what I think is part of the point of this, which is showing that Lysair's position, as abhorrent as it is not altogether absolutely wrong in every single instance. Because of the curse on both of them, this is a danger. This is something that threatens the world, could threaten the world. And given Arathon's level of power, his level of training, his skills, he could be devastating for the world. And when we consider that Lysair always sees Arathon that way, he cannot countenance thinking of Arathon in any other way, we realize why he is so dead set on this. Plus, obviously, the curse is coming into play and it is shaping it. But again, if we place ourselves in Lysair's shoes and we think of this person, and the only way we can see them is the very worst, most demonic, most evil form that they could ever possibly take. If that's what we see when we think of them, when someone mentions their name, we can understand his zeal. And of course, added to this is the fact that he is being spurred by a curse that has influenced him and made him do some incredibly terrible things. And then the conflict that he has in his own mind of, I have done all of these terrible things. I know these are terrible things, but I'm not a terrible person. How can both these statements be true? Oh, put the blame on someone else. Say that you've been forced to do it because of someone else's actions. You had to do that. You had no choice. And again, this is a very real exploration of psychology. If our expectations are that two sides are going to be set up in a conflict and both sides are going to be roughly equal, some with strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others, and the other side, having different strengths and weaknesses, and it's going to be a conflict between the two of them fighting it out. That's not what this story A promised or B is trying to do. Asymmetric warfare is a thing. Understanding that a dominant colonial force wages war very differently from a group of insurgents or a group of indigenous peoples trying to survive. And an exploration of that. And again, that has played out through our history. And it can be very difficult to admit that the cultures we come from, the countries we come from, the people we are descended from, engaged in behavior that we find morally repugnant. But it is part of our history. It is part of our world. It is part of the countries and cultures and backgrounds we come from. And so while Traders In has a lot of issues with this series, again, it's fine. There are different ways of approaching texts to actually think about them, to engage with them. You don't have to. No one is forcing you to. But if you're struggling with, oh, why are the people so dumb? You go, why do you think they have the information that you have? And even if they had all of that information, are you understanding the psychology and the background of the people that you are projecting your view, your moral judgments, and your perspective onto? Because some stories are written that way, that we do that. Remedy Feist's Magician, in that, despite the fact it is a highly patriarchal world, everything we're shown about the world is patriarchal. Well, the Kingdom of the Isles I'm talking about. And there's clearly very clearly assigned and delineated gender roles. And yet all of the good male characters are all, 90s feminists. Despite the fact that it is radically divergent from the world. It makes no sense in the context in which they live. It makes no sense in the world in which they live. But Feist did that so that modern readers would feel far more comfortable reading about them. Think of the difficulty that people have when they look at these patriarchal, misogynistic secondary worlds, and then a male character does something that fits with that mindset, and they go, well, I just lost all sympathy for them. They are a product of that place. Did you want them to act against their characteristics, their background, their psychology, their culture, because it conforms to ours? And again, there are stories that play with it. There are stories that investigate all of this. But expecting it all the time, instead of trying to think about it from the position of those characters, understanding the character and the character motivation and understanding the context in which it is placed does not mean that you have to go, oh, yeah, well, I agree with that type of behavior and I think we should do that in today's world. No, that is not what any of this is about. But judging characters by today's standards, when they exist in a secondary world, when they exist in a completely different culture and society, and saying, oh, well, they shouldn't do that thing. Maybe they wouldn't if they had been brought up in our world, but they weren't brought up in our world. So is what they are doing psychologically real? And again, it doesn't mean that you have to like it. It doesn't mean that it says that you personally condone this action. No, none of that is to say that you have to do those things. But being aware that it is being true to the world means that you don't necessarily have to go, oh, well, he's just that type of character. And that can be exhausting because that's placing a moral judgment on characters based on moral precepts and concepts that the secondary world can't support. It's projecting our view of morality into a secondary world. And again, it doesn't excuse different authors explore this and use this in different ways. But it is something to bear in mind. But a lot of this came about because of Praterzin's comment, but also because recently I mentioned Robin Hobb and a review of Assassin's Apprentice, where the person was really dissatisfied with the book because it didn't match what they thought it was going to be. Even though what they thought it was going to be is completely based on a whole load of assumptions they made that the book didn't make, the author didn't make, the blurb didn't make. It was how they interpreted the words on the page to say, oh, well, it's going to be this thing. Oh, well, it didn't do that thing. Well, this is bad writing then. I've been lied to. The only person who was lying in that whole interpretation was the reader. They lied to themselves. This book is going to be about this thing. Who says, well, if you look at this sentence, that's not what that sentence says. You've interpreted it that way, and in fact, misinterpreted it. And that happens to all of us. We do this all the time. And so I thought this would be a good time to have this kind of refresher. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.